Welcome to the Inver Hills Annual Research Conference. I'm glad you guys could all come today. My name is Lisa Tracy, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Research Conference. And I'm just pleased to have you here today to meet someone that I respect so much, and I'm glad could be our keynote for today. So I'm going to give you just a few logistic pieces of information before I introduce Jack. So many of you guys may have signed in on your way in, but if you didn't, on your way out, could you please sign in so we know who's been here? At that time, you get a program that tells you what other events are going on today and tomorrow, and you also get your pizza ticket once you sign in out there. The other thing we track is how many people come to each session. So we've got sign-in sheets that we're gonna send around while Jack is talking, and you just write your name, but please write it clearly, because I type up all those names. It's not for signatures, it's for name writing, okay? Thank you. The other thing I want to say is that after the presentation today, Jack has been willing to stick around for another hour. So we're going to have a special time in this room where if you want to stay around and learn more about what he's been talking about, you're welcome to stay with a small group and have a small group discussion for another hour afterwards. Okay, and now it's my honor to introduce Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer. He's an associate professor of Justice and Peace Studies at St. Thomas, and full disclosure, he was my professor for a couple of years when I went to St. Thomas, so it's nice to have him back here. He teaches active nonviolence, intro to justice and peace studies, public policy analysis and advocacy. He's a nationally recognized teacher, writer, public speaker, and an activist committed to nonviolent change. He's got a life that's been focused on work connecting between faith as well as economic, political, and social issues. Additionally, he's the author of 13 books focused on hunger, poverty, U.S. foreign policy, and theology. His most recent book is called Authentic Hope. It's the end of the world as we know it, but soft landings are possible. He's also been the National Program Coordinator for Politics of Food Program, as well as the Director of Hunger and Justice Project, as well as he worked in Nicaragua for the Center for Global Education. And his current work focuses mostly on climate change and healthcare. You may also remember him from, in 2008, he ran for the Democratic nomination for Senate against Al Franken. So who knows how it would have turned out if Jack was in his role instead. But thank you for coming today. We're really glad you're here. I just want to say one more thing, that this event was funded in part by the Research Conference, but also by the Diverse Perspectives Pedagogy series that we have on campus. So thanks to all these groups who have been able to help us bring Jack on campus. And with that, let's thank Jack for coming.
Thank you. Well, if any of you are interested, she was a very good student. So. Well, I want to say, first of all, I am just really impressed with this whole event. And it's something that at the university where I'm at, we're really trying to make happen more, which is to get students together across disciplines to focus on issues. So over the last couple of years, my program, Justice and Peace Studies Department, has been choosing an issue. Last year we focused on climate change. This year we focused on gun violence and military violence. And about 14 different disciplines wrestled with that issue together. We had, but this reminds me of that, and it's very impressive. So thank you for including me to be part of this. I want to begin this talk about meaningful success and accountability in the context of systemic injustices with just a couple of comments. There are actually two questions I want to pose to you. The first question is, do you believe it is possible to improve quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our ecological footprints? Do you believe it's possible to improve quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our resource use, our ecological footprint? And let me just ask, how many would say yes? Quite a few, and a few that don't. The second question I would ask is, do you believe it's possible to make that change within the context of present systems? And I'm talking about value systems, economic systems, political systems, educational systems, healthcare systems. So within the context of where we're at as a country and a people, do you think, how many of you think that transition is likely? That's the rub, right? Right there is the problem. And that's what I want to talk about today. And even whether or not we're willing to ask those two questions is really, really important. If you're willing to at least ask the question and then wrestle with the pathways that we might need to take. My next kind of preface comment is just to say a little bit about what I think the purpose of a college is, or a university. And later I'm going to share a few stories about how important college was for me in terms of helping me find a way in the world, a new way to think about the world and my role in it. But it seems to me there are kind of two fundamental ways that a college or university defines itself. And maybe I'm going to suggest a hybrid. But the first is most of us have heard, and you probably heard this, or you thought about this, at least as you were thinking about your education. Most universities and colleges say to you as a student, come to our university or our college because we're going to help you succeed. Now, that in itself isn't bad. How many of you would go to a university that said, come to our college or university and we're going to help you fail? That wouldn't work very well. But the point I want to make is that kind of implicit in that first definition, come and we're going to help you succeed, could actually have a trailer. And if we're not careful, the trailer would be, come to our college, we're going to help you succeed, even in an unjust world, even in a world of tremendous systemic injustices. Now, I will tell you that I was influenced profoundly by the time that I lived and worked in Central America. And at the time, the United States was backing a series of repressive governments, backing, in the case of Nicaragua, a terrorist army. The CIA produced manuals on how to maximize the psychological impact of terrorizing the civilian population. In El Salvador, the U.S. backed brutal, brutal governments. I don't know how many of you come from any kind of a religious framework, but some of you may have heard that the U.S. trained forces killed 6 Jesuit priests, dragged them out of their university housing, and brutally murdered them. And they brutally murdered them because of their vision of the university. So the second kind of vision of a college or a university, in my view, was actually the university that I discovered in San Salvador. And there, what they said to students was this. They said, we want you to come to our university, and we're going to help equip you with the skills that you need for transformation. The transformation of injustices in your neighborhood, in your community, in your country, and in the world. And so, from my vantage point, the reason that I choose to teach is I really believe in that kind of second vision of the university. But I would probably add, I would probably say it's a hybrid. We attend a college and a university because we want to get skills. We attend a university because we want to be equipped to have jobs. We want to be able to feed ourselves and our families, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. It should be a part of why we go to college. But I also believe that the purpose of a university is to help us do that in a context of paying very, very close attention to the systemic injustices that we are living in the midst of every day. So that's kind of the frame I'm bringing to this conversation. Now, as Lisa mentioned, I happen to teach in a program that was ideally suited for my concerns as an activist as well as an academic, and that is a Department of Justice and Peace Studies. Now, what I want to tell you is that Justice and Peace Studies came very late in my concern. And I grew up in essentially an all-white suburb, Coon Rapids, Minnesota at the time. The civil rights movement was happening. I missed it because nobody talked about it. The Vietnam War, the wars of the United States and Indochina were raging. I had not one teacher, I had not one pastor, I had not one adult in my life who talked about that war. And meanwhile, I was being socialized into a very, very, very limited worldview. And I'm going to challenge you a little bit too, because, or at least have you think about your own socialization. That my socialization was crystal clear. The United States of America was a benevolent superpower, and it was out there fighting against an evil empire and fighting for good all over the world. And I think yours is pretty much the same. Only the narrative has shifted from anti-communism, and communism was the word that was used in my socialization to shut down any thinking. Any critical thinking could be shut down just by using that term or framing an issue in relation to the U.S. battling communism. That was the justification for supporting brutal, brutal dictatorships in many, many parts of the world. I would suggest for you, just substitute terrorism for communism, and we're susceptible to the same kind of reflexive, cheap, patriotic stuff that gets in the way of us being responsible citizens, responsible for issues that we face in our own country, and responsible also for influencing or trying to influence the U.S. role throughout much of the world. All right, so for me, this concern about justice and peace came belatedly, came as a result of college. And I was going to college again at the time that the U.S. wars in Indochina were raging. It was before the internet. We had to struggle really hard to try to find out what was going on. But we learned some things. We got glimpses that it wasn't just about Vietnam, that the U.S. was dropping, it ended up dropping more bombs on Laos secretly as part of a secret war than it had dropped on Japan and Germany throughout all of World War II. So the war we had to pay attention to because there was the draft. And all of us had to pull a number out of a hat, and depending upon that number, made it very likely that you would end up fighting in a war that you may not know anything about, in a place you know nothing about, drawing on those patriotic impulses. So that, we paid attention to that, and I paid attention to that. And that opened up a lot more of a need for critical thinking. And then I took advantage of programs at the college I was at. So having grown up in an all-white suburb, I chose to study in inner city Chicago for a semester, about as far away from my life experiences as I can imagine. And there I was faced with incredible poverty, institutionalized racism. And I began to see, even though these were just thoughts that were emerging, I began to see, if any of you are familiar with Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, April 4th, 1967, exactly 51 years ago, earlier this month. He talked about the relationship between poverty and war. And he said that the United States would never, ever, ever address the problems of poverty and inequality as long as we were, his words were, we were just sucking resources and sucking human and financial resources into this giant suction tube. He called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he saw how the impact of that in his own community, the African-American communities throughout the country. So I was beginning to pay attention and raise new questions. And then, you know, this is a privileged thing for sure, but I had the opportunity to also, the next year, study in India, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Japan, and spent some time in Israel, Palestine. That also was just a jolting experience. I mentioned my socialization that I believed that the United States was this benevolent superpower helping. But whenever I read a newspaper, no matter in what country I was in, outside of the United States, it talked about the U.S. engagement in Indochina in completely different terms. The United States was an aggressor nation. It wasn't there fighting for freedom and democracy. In Ethiopia, when I traveled there, I thought, boy, people are going to be glad to see our group of Americans because the United States is helping the Ethiopian government. I was in Ethiopia for 30 days, and every time we were in a public place and they found out that we were Americans, we were pelted with stones. I had no way of making sense out of that in terms of my socialization. So one of the things that I take out of what I'm sharing with you is that all of us, myself included, need to recognize the limitations of our social location, the place we live, the family we've grown up in. The world that we have inhabited is both a lens through which we understand the world and a limitation of how small that world can be. So that, for me, is an invitation for two things. One, humility, that we're all captive to our limited experiences. I believe that one of the most hopeful reasons for change, that I believe that change is possible, is because I was capable of changing. And if an oblivious human being, and that's what I was capable of changing because I experienced new realities, new experiences, people's struggles, issues that I did not have to wrestle with in my own process of growing up, but that were the everyday experiences for other people. And the second great thing to come out of is not just humility, but it has to be curiosity and a determination to want to grapple with, to want to know more, to be willing to face contradictions, and to be willing to examine the implications that that might have for each of us as we define for ourselves, because no one can define it for you, what it means to live an authentic life. It's one of the questions I ask my students towards the end of the introductory class that I teach. I have them write down, how do you define for yourself what it means to live an authentic life in light of what you know, what you've been learning, the issues you've been facing? Then I ask them to think about, well, once you've done that, what are the obstacles that you see getting in the way of you living the life that you want to live, that you know that you need to live with authenticity? And then I ask them to think about, maybe most importantly, what do you need to overcome those obstacles? So those are three questions I would really encourage you along the way. As you think about those powerful issues that I see out on those poster boards that you've been grappling with, think about that knowledge invading your life to a point where you can no longer be the same person that you were before you knew those things. So think about your own definition for yourself of what a meaningful life is and how you can face obstacles and overcome them that might get in the way. All right. Well, I could tell you many, many, many more stories of the contradictions that I experienced living outside of the United States. But I think the point that I wanted to make has been made. So I want you to, if you can do this those of you who have paper, this might be easier. But so I'm interested in peace and justice. And the question, though, is, well, what do we mean by justice? And what do we mean by peace? And John Rawls is a philosopher. I don't normally like philosophy. It's too abstract for me. But John Rawls was a philosopher in which he thought about justice. And so he had this exercise, and I just want you to think about it with me. The exercise, he said, was this. So I want you to imagine that you know for sure that you're going to live in this particular society, okay, this particular country or society. You know for sure you're going to be there. But Rawls said, what you don't know is you don't know where you're going to land in that society. You don't know, am I going to be rich? Am I going to be poor? Am I going to be fully abled or have some disabilities? Am I going to be old? Am I going to be sick? All those things you don't know in this exercise. And so Rawls said, I want you to construct some of the basic things about your society, knowing you're going to live there, but not knowing what your social location is going to be, what your economic situation is going to be. Now, if I asked you to do that, how many of you would like the present U.S. healthcare system? I wouldn't either. How many of you would want to do what most of the rest of the, well, what all of the industrial or developed world does, which is healthcare is a right, and everybody has access to basic healthcare? That is a moral decision that all of those countries have made, and the absence of that here is also a moral decision that is being made, or in this case, in my view, an immoral decision. So I think one of the gravest, or one of the deepest challenges that we face in this country is that we have eroded a sense of empathy and commonality in favor of a fairly ruthless idea of what life is about. And what life is about individual competition and individual gain outside of the framework of the systems that are impacting our life. What the John Rawls experiment does is it encourages us to think about a society that we want to live in. And I think my experience in using this in classes is that students almost always create a much fairer, much more just society as they think about the country that they want to live in, the social system that they want to live in. All right, if you'll track with me one more time, I want to share with you, there was a poll conducted not all that long ago. None of you are going to be able to see this, but I'm going to hold it up and tell you what it is. So those of you who do have paper, make a circle, make 2 circles, and label one circle country A, and the other circle country B. And those of you who don't have paper, that's okay. Just, I think you'll be able to track this. And what the survey looked at is the wealth distribution in these 2 mythical countries, country A and country B. And I'm just going to tell you 2 of the figures. So in country A, the richest 20% have 84% of the country's wealth. So in country A, the richest 20% have 84% of the country's wealth. In country A, the bottom 40% have less than 0.3% of the wealth. Okay? So you got 84% for the richest 20%. The poorest 40% in country A have less than 0.3% of the country's wealth. Okay, that gives you an idea of the wealth distribution in country A. Country B, the richest 20% have 36% of the country's wealth, and the bottom 40% have 26% of the country's wealth. Okay, so what can we say about country A relative to country B? Country A sucks. Yeah, and it sucks because it's very, very unequal, right? These are kind of shockingly unequal. Well, so the poll, it asks people, if you had to choose which country you would want to live in terms of a wealth distribution pattern, would you choose the wealth distribution of country A or country B? How many of you would choose to live in country A? How many B? Well, you're pretty consistent with the polls. The polls show that over 90% of Americans, doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, over 90% chose that they would prefer to live in country B's wealth distribution. Well, country A is the United States. Country B is roughly Sweden. Now, the other really kind of disturbing thing about this poll is it showed that most Americans taking that survey thought they were living more in country B than they were in country A. They had no idea how unequal that we were. And the other thing that it showed was the people in the United States who took this poll dramatically overestimated the social mobility that exists within the country. that they thought we have a lot of social mobility and these other countries that are more equal, they don't have any. It turns out that that's not true. The U.S. has the lowest degree of social mobility of all the developed countries. So again, I want us thinking, I want you unleashing your imaginations, and not just your imaginations, but your actually hands and feet, to think about how do we begin to construct narratives that we are a people, that we are a community, that our well-being is in fact related to the well-being of our neighbors. And I'm gonna talk a little bit later, kind of towards the end. I want to tell you all the benefits that come if you're living in a more equitable society, and all the detrimental things that are associated with living in a highly unequal, highly inequitable country. All right. So I want to very briefly depress you for a couple minutes, and I want to touch on five issues, five systemic issues that I believe we have a responsibility as we are making life choices to be engaged in trying to make improvements in these areas. So just, again, very quickly, because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. The first is inequality. Again, it's hard to imagine how unequal this nation is. And by the way, we just got a lot more unequal as a result of the recent tax cut that was passed, that will distribute nearly all of the benefits to the richest 1%. Before that tax cut, the richest 1% of U.S. families has wealth greater than 95% of U.S. families added together. That's how unequal we have become. As a consequence of that, nearly 1 of 5 children in the United States lives in poverty. Richest country on earth, and 1 out of 5 children are living in poverty. Oxfam reports that the 8 richest people in the world, they have wealth greater than half of humanity. 8 people. 8, half of humanity. So challenging issue is keeping that inequality in mind and holding up a goal of how do we become more equitable is very, very important. The second big challenge, and this is the one that I kind of started with my preface comment, is the challenge of living responsibly within the context of ecological limits. One of the gravest challenges that we face is that economics in our country and globally is disconnected from ecological reality. The idea of unlimited growth as the solution to any problem, whether that problem be poverty or other things, is simply ecologically irresponsible. It's very interesting to me when I was writing this book, Authentic Hope. I came across a study in Britain. And in Britain, the question had been raised, is the growth assumptions in the British and global economy, are those growth assumptions at all realistic in terms of ecological reality? And so in Britain, they appointed a commission of economists and others to examine this question. And lo and behold, they came back and they said, it's absolutely unrealistic. So there is a kind of recognition, without actually acting on the recognition, that we're in trouble. And of course, climate change is, from my vantage point, the most visible now and most pressing example of this deeper problem. The deeper problem is the disconnect between ecology and economics. Climate change is a very, very serious manifestation for that. So to all the young people in the room, I simply apologize that what my generation has done, the problems that we're leaving you with, that we're burdening on you, but these are problems that I will be working with you kicking and screaming until I'm not here, but these are issues that you will not be able to turn away from. that we are going to have to continue working and deepen our involvement in trying to move very, very, very quickly in a different direction. The third problem that I want to touch on is the erosion of democracy. You know, it's very, how many of you are frustrated with our political process? I'm just interested. A lot of us. And some of you with two hands. I will tell you, having entered the arena as a very reluctant candidate, this is a very, very difficult arena, but it's too important to ignore. But I would just call your attention to one book that I found really helpful. It was a book called Winner Take All Politics. It came out a couple of years ago, and was written by two sociologists, and they just looked at why is the United States so unequal? And they looked at globalization, they looked at training, they looked at education levels, they looked at all kinds of things. But they came back and they said, politics. That is the reason we're so unequal. Why do the other countries that I mentioned have a better healthcare system than we do? Politics. They have better politics. And in this book, they looked at the corrosive influence that money has had on both political parties. This is a problem, they say quite openly and honestly, they say the Republican Party is the big problem. They're actively seeking to transfer wealth from working class and poor people to the upper echelons. They have a strategy that they want to drive up deficits, and then they want to come back and cut things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. So if you're a Republican, you have a lot of work to do within your political choice. But if you're a Democrat, you're not off the hook either, because in their analysis, the Democrat is a much bigger tent. It's got some great people who are working on economic justice and on health care reform and looking at climate change as a serious problem and an opportunity. How do we move in the right direction? But they also acknowledge that the Democrats have had tremendous influence, or the influence of Wall Street and other financial groupings on the Democratic Party, and how all it takes now to block meaningful reforms is to have the Republican Party lined up for it, and then you just pick off a handful of Democrats, and you can basically keep bad policies in place. So we're operating, and I'm just going to say this. I always tell my students, okay, this is a Jackism. A Jackism is when Jack tells you something he thinks is really true. It may not be true. You have to decide for yourself, but I think it's important to share. So here's my Jackism for you for the day. My Jackism is that we did not elect a Republican or a Democrat as president. We elected an authoritarian. And that's very, very dangerous. Very dangerous. Interesting, the Atlantic Monthly had an article by two people who are independents. They vote Democrat, they vote Republican, and they wrote this article in this month's issue of the Atlantic, and they said, it is the duty of every citizen at every level of government to vote the Republicans out. Not because of climate change, although you might make a reason for that, but because the very structure and fabric of our democracy is being undermined, and the Republican Party is enabling it. So think about that in terms of political dysfunction. And again, I come to you as someone who is highly, highly critical of the Democratic Party as well, and believe what we need is a much deeper transformation in our political system. Okay, the fourth issue I'll mention, and actually I should have said that this is probably the one that I'm focused on more than any, and it's the one that I have the least support in doing. You know, it's really interesting to me that we are living in a permanent warfare state and almost nobody notices. The United States has been at war my entire lifetime. I was born in 1951. There's not a time in which the United States wasn't engaged in military conflict. So what I'll say to you here in shorthand, and I'm happy to take questions either right after I speak now or during that extra time for people who can stay around. But there's a difference between national security, national defense, and power projection. It's a very big difference between using your military as a power projection force. So here's the most controversial thing that I write about and then I'll say, but I'll say it. U.S. soldiers aren't dying for their country. They're dying because of the indifference of their countrymen and women who can't be bothered to pay attention to the nature of the wars that we are asking them to fight. So that requires, if I'm at all right about that, about any of this, it requires us to be civically engaged, politically engaged, using our voices. And I have lots and lots of veteran friends, and they actually appreciate when I say that. And they also appreciate when I say that cheap patriotism and cheap veneration of troops is not the friend of soldiers. Throwing out the first pitch, having flyovers at the baseball game, having all these kind of bringing before us this kind of cheap way for the American people to say, thank you for your service, is not the friend of soldiers. If we were the friend of soldiers, we would prevent them from being sent into wars that should not be fought. We would direct our foreign policy to being about defense, not power projection, and we would make sure that we take care of the people when they come back, because they're coming back many times with serious psychological and physical wounds. All right, the fifth challenge is maybe the one that offers some real possibility. And that is, it's the challenge of meaning. I'm talking about meaning. What is life's purpose? Where do we find meaning? So I'm gonna say something I say to my students. I say, in the future, the economy that we're going to need to build is going to be different. It's not going to be the mass consumption economy. If we're going to transition to a different future, a livable future, a sustainable future, as well as a sustainable present, the purpose of the economy is going to be to provide the material foundation for meaning-based societies. The material foundation. It's hard to find meaning if you're starving. It's hard to find meaning if you don't have a place to live. It's hard to find meaning if you're struggling with health care. It's hard to find meaning if we don't have an economy and even a vision of what our country should be that includes all of us. And the well-being, that basic well-being, becomes a foundation for meaning. Now, sometimes when I say that, people look like some of you are looking, like a kind of a blank stare. What the heck is he talking about? But I want you to think about it. If I were to ask you the question, what is it that gives you meaning? I would throw something out. What gives you meaning? Someone. Where do you find meaning? People, relationships, family. How many of you enjoy getting together with friends around a good meal? How many of you like music? How many of you like art, plays? All those things that I've named and many more that we could name are things that enrich our lives, that bring us joy, that bring us happiness, and they all share something really, really important in common. They're not very materially intensive, or they don't have to be. Or they don't have to be. Well, so where does this leave us? From my vantage point, each of us is accountable in 4 ways. Accountable for trying to examine honestly and to take action where possible to try to build the kind of society that I'm talking about. And these are the 4 areas. Personal choice, personal action, all very, very important. A lot of us, even within the framework of the constraints of our lives, the social constraints that we may have in terms of our social location and our upbringing and our incomes and all of those things, personal choices still are very, very important. Second, you're at a stage now where many of you, by virtue of being in college, are starting to think about vocation. You know, what kind of job? And vocation is more than job, but it certainly includes job. And so trying to think about, are there ways where the things that I'm good at and the things that bring me joy and meaning intersect with the needs of communities and things that I care about, issues that I care about? If you can find those places, run to them. Not all of us can. but it's a worthy pursuit. The third is civic engagement. You know, one of the more disturbing trends for me is that when I went to college, I'm ancient, but when I went to college, I would get to class early, and some of the most wonderful conversations were taking place in the context of that. Now when I get to my classroom, I have 20 or 25 students, and they're all on an individual device. And oftentimes, and unless I remind them, when class is over, they're almost immediately plugged in. Or at least that's the culture of the university. I think Justice and Peace Studies students now, tend to be more relational. Civic engagement is saying that we are going to be engaged in our communities, wherever that community can be. It can be through church, it can be through bowling, it can be through volunteering at your school, it can be through a community organization. But being engaged in the sense, again, that my well-being is tied up to the well-being of others and to the community and to taking steps to be there. And then the fourth one is that frustrating arena that I talked about, is that we all need to be politically engaged and to have our I would hope, have our political engagement informed by some of the issues that I've touched on today. I want to close with two things. I want to list you the benefits of equity. So these come from sociologists who have examined the United States relative to other developed countries. And it turns out that the United States comes out last or near last on every measure of social well-being. That's shocking. The U.S. comes out last or next to last in almost every measure of social well-being. And I'm just going to name the ones that that's true for, related to equity or inequity. Equitable societies have higher empathy and trust. Unequal ones, low empathy and trust. There's more cooperation in equitable societies. There's a competitive, less cooperation in unequal ones. There's community cohesiveness, benefit of equity. And you can fill out the opposites. I'm just going to do the benefits of equity. There's lower alcohol and drug addiction with equity. There's better physical and mental health. There's more gender equality. There's more political participation, employment, earnings, social economic autonomy for women in societies that are more equitable. There's a higher life expectancy. So here's the figure that really got my attention. Do you know that the richest person in the United States, the richest people in the United States live shorter lives than the poorest people in Sweden? The richest people in the United States, on average, live shorter lives than the poorest people in Sweden. You know why? Because it's not healthy to live in an unequal society. It's not healthy to live in an unequal society. So higher life expectancy, better self-esteem, lower infant mortality, lower child poverty, less crime, less violent crime, fewer homicides, less violence, less social distance separating us, less obesity, fewer prisoners, less punitive prisons, more generosity, more foreign aid, less belligerent foreign policies, and higher social mobility. That's a pretty lengthy list. And if you were to ask me, what is a society we're striving for? It would be a society that made improvements in all of these areas as a result of being in it together, of being able to judge our successes in relation to the well-being of ourselves, our family, our community, our state, our nation, our world. So this, for me, this transition that I'm talking about and this invitation to you to think about success in the context of our responsibility to live within society and to help transform that society, here are 4 values that I think are really important. The first one is humility. There's a lot of arrogance, and I just try to encourage people to recognize the limitations of our social locations and our life experiences, which is why we so desperately need each other. And we need to be able to listen to people carefully, deeply, even people with whom we have profound disagreements. Humility helps with that. Second, compassion. When I was, well, I am a parent, and when my kids were younger, I would often ask, what do you want for your children? And almost everybody answers that question, I want my children to be happy. And I always answered the question, I want my children to be compassionate. Because I really believed that if my children were compassionate, they would be happy. And I'm happy to report that my children who are compassionate are happy. So I think compassion. Third one, similarly, is empathy. Empathy is an ability and a willingness to see the world and to see problems through the lens of others. Democracy cannot function without empathy. And I would just like you to think about the political discourse in our country coming from the very top that is the absolute opposite of empathy. It's about fear, it's about division, it's about exclusion. Those are values that we need to push aside in favor of humility, compassion, and empathy. And whether you're a religious person or not, and I'm not sure where I fall anymore, I would say the golden rule would be a great guide. We should do to others what we would want others to do to us. We should treat others the way that we would want to be treated. You know, one of the things that I think can motivate us for change, at least this I hope, is that when I'm talking to adults a little bit younger than me who have younger children, I ask them if it's fair for them as adults to be making decisions that are robbing their children of a future. And no one wants to rob their children of a future. And yet that's what we're doing. So the golden rule needs to apply not just to our children, not just to our families, not just to our closest relations, not just to our closest friends, but we need to extend that all the way out to the nation, to the world, and I would argue to the earth itself. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. And I think we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, it's 10:50. I know some of you guys have to be places at 11, so if you have to go, it's okay to take off. If you want to stay for it, we'll take 2 questions, and then after that, if you want to stay and ask more questions, you can stay. Jack here, and he'll spend an hour doing small group discussion. And do remember, if you want pizza, you've got to register, and then we'll go to the schedule for the conference. So you can find that right out on the left. Thank you. 2 questions for Jack.
Yes.
The golden rule is something I think we may need to look at a little bit.
Okay.
It's not how we want to treat it, the amount of diversity, it's how that person needs to be.
Very good. Yeah. She said we may need to, yes, she said we may need to rethink the golden rule, because it's not just about how we want to be treated, it's how the other person wants to be treated. Very good. I appreciate that. And another comment or question from anyone? Yes. Yes. Okay, how do we change the wealth distribution pattern in the United States? I'll just throw out a few ideas. One, we changed the tax code because the tax code has been changed profoundly over the last 30 and 40 years, all in the other direction. It's not an accident that we have these high degrees. It's a matter of public policy. So there are 2 things there. One is to stop doing that. Those are sins of commission. But we also need a politics that will allow us to make changes. So that would help. Second thing that would help is we need, and this is something that I'm getting ready to retire from teaching probably in a year or so. And I think I'm going to devote a lot of time to trying to help make Minnesota the first state in the country to establish a single-payer healthcare system. Because that's the kind of thing that would have a significant impact. If we all had health care that is a huge, huge benefit. Then we can also start talking about living wages and increasing minimum wages. That would help. So there are mechanisms like that. And then some economists have actually proposed, and I think that this would be a good idea for a while, to have a wealth tax, to have a tax on wealth, and use those resources to help make the transition to a sustainable society, address climate change, address issues of inequality. Another very practical one that I'm guessing some of you would appreciate is there's no reason in this country that you attending this university or this college, it should be paid for. You should not be going into debt to do this. And if you think that's unrealistic, many, many years ago I wrote a book in which at that time, if you just limited the home interest loan deduction to at that time to like $250,000. In other words, people with a $250,000 house could write off that. That's the way home mortgage deduction works. If you just set it at $250,000, you would free up enough resources to allow every student who wanted to attend a public university free. Now, I didn't talk about it, but if you look at the president's budget, and this is a bipartisan problem, 61 cents out of every dollar in the discretionary budget, that's the budget that Congress controls, 61 cents out of every dollar is going to war. And another 8 cents is going to veterans benefits, and that number keeps growing because of the nature of the emotional and physical problems that soldiers are coming back with. So those priorities, you know, when people say we can't afford to do something, I say nonsense. What we can't afford is the present priorities. We are a rich country, and it should be seen in I also want to encourage you, I say this, I want you to be humble and I want you to be kind. I also want young people to be angry about injustice. I want you to talk to adults and just in their face and very kindly but very directly tell them that what they are doing with our world is not okay with you. So galvanizing your parents, galvanizing people in your world to make some of those changes. But it's not impossible.